Well, the time has finally come to do some very critical maintenance. So critical, in fact, that you should do this the second you pick up your bike, even if it's brand new from a dealership. And it's so critical that I'm just now getting around to it after 3 years. That means we're talking about linkage bearings. So manufacturers are known to skimp out on lubrication points anywhere outside of the engine from factory. So things like the linkage bearings, swing arm bearings, axles, all of that stuff can tend to dry out early. So it's a good idea to inspect these right away and relubricate if necessary so they don't dry out and wear out earlier than they should. And yes, I've had my Sierra for over 3 years at this point and have not so much as looked at the linkage bearings. But this is intentional because I want to show you what happens if you don't do this right away so that you know what to avoid. Yeah, see, that was intentional and totally not procrastination on my part. But whether or not this is a brand new bike or you've had yours for 3 years as well, we're gonna go over all the steps in removal, inspection, relubrication, and hopefully not replacing, but I wouldn't put myself past that, so no way to do it but to get to it. So the first thing is the prep, of course. We gotta put this on a center stand so that the rear end is up in the air, so that way we can make sure that this thing is secure when we take everything off. And now that we have it on the center stand, another thing that I want to point out is that normally when you put this on the center stand like this, you want it, relatively balanced so that you can work with the wheels in the air. But in this case, we're going to be working exclusively on the rear here, and so that it doesn't shift when you actually take the weight off of the rear, it's a good idea to actually scoot this thing forward enough that the front wheel is on the ground and planted, so that way when you're taking weight off the back, it's not going to tip or potentially just tip over on top of you. So now that we got this thing secured and up in the air, we can take a look underneath to see more of what the actual linkage bearings look like and what we're going to be dealing with and removing, of course. A couple of different components with this. We have these rods. There's one on each side here, and then it's attached to this kind of knuckle thing, which has 3 different attachment points. So it's actually attached to the rod, the bottom of the rear shock. That's actually what holds that in, as well as secured to the swing arm up top here. But before we go loosening and taking out any of the actual linkage components, I think it's probably best first to take off the rear tire. Unfortunately, with a Supermoto setup, this is going to be a little bit annoying, but that will get things out of the way like the chain, and I think some other things like the foot peg and maybe even the kickstand need to come off as well. So yeah, taking a look underneath, I think we actually do need to take off at the very least this left-hand side, the foot peg, the kickstand, this whole assembly really. And in order to take off the assembly, we actually need to get to a bolt back here. So first thing is to take off this foot peg, and this is a Motion Factory Racing foot peg, by the way. It actually flexes, which is really cool. I actually have a few videos on this, and if you're interested in one of these, by the way, if you go to motionfactoryracing.com, you can use code LEXDFOX and get yourself 10% off. Okay, now that we have all the obstacles out of the way, we can see a little bit more clearly all the bolts that need to be loosened first, I think, and then eventually taken out so we can actually pull everything out of here. So on this side, the left side, we have a small bolt right here for the roller, which I think goes through to this rod. Okay, that one was just a preview. So we had the 10 mil that was just holding the roller. Now there's actually another 12 mil, I think, behind that one. Oh, there we go. Knuckles right to the swing arm, but we got it out. Since we're still on this side, we'll try the next one, the rear shock right here. Now these ones that are all connected to the knuckles, thankfully only have a bolt on one side. You can see like this one right here, it has this kind of squared off end so that it doesn't rotate itself. So we'll see if this one wants to comply. Oh, kind of. Oh, there we go. Woo! And finally on this side, we have a swing arm bolt right up here. That is really annoying. So my socket actually does not fit in there. It's kind of tucked in underneath the swing arm. That's really annoying. Let's see if an extension helps me out. Ah, that's the ticket. Ah. Good Lord. Now let's move you over to the right. And one last one to loosen on this side is this lower knuckle right here. There we go. Now we should be able to take all these things out pretty easily. Whoops. Now we got it out and on the bench, and I did clean it up a little bit, and I'm actually not thinking that this is going to be as bad as I think. For instance, right here on these upper rod bolts right here, you can see this one I cleaned up, but this one is how it came out, and it is pretty greasy. So that's a good sign, I think, that means there is still some lubrication in there even after 3 years. And I don't know, 6,000 miles or something. But first thing is I'm going to disassemble this even further. I just had this thing roughly together the way it is on the bike, just for my own reference, because there are a lot of nuts and bolts here. You want to make sure that you keep these organized. Although I think it's actually going to be pretty easy to see when you're reassembling this thing, especially the knuckle, because this is the most important piece here. But if you look, each of these 3 different points all have different widths. So it's pretty easy to see that this is going to correspond to specific points, and so it's not really going to fit incorrectly, so you can't mess this thing up. We'll start with the big one here. It's pretty easy to get in here. There's this metal cap right here that just pops off. Same on the other side. So you can see behind that it has a rubber seal and this little rod on both sides, and you can see that it's moving back and forth, and it's actually moving back and forth pretty easily, which means there is some good grease in there, but we're gonna repack it anyway. And this is where I'm not gonna go fully disassembling it, but just enough so that I can pack things. So this is something that's very important and something you wanna keep in mind of, because you could mess this thing up if you're just looking to replace some of the grease and not actually pulling everything out of here. Oh no! No. So to avoid that, I'm actually just gonna push this halfway through carefully, and we'll get a pen light in there so you can see all those little rods. Those are the bearings, and they're just free sitting in there. They're just pressed in there against the inside rod and the grease, of course. And you can see just behind it, there's not that much to begin with. So while this is actually still moving pretty nicely and fluidly, it doesn't feel like it's binding up in any way. There is just some remnants of grease in there, and so if you were to continue with this, I don't think it would be holding up very well for the long run. So as I hold the rod halfway out, we're gonna start on this side and just put a fingerful of grease in there. And I'm just gonna carefully push my finger in there without really touching the sides. And so right now I'm just scraping it into the center so we can at least get that filled up. Now you can see that empty cavity is not so empty anymore. I packed it with grease, maybe a little too much, but once this slides out, it'll push some of that excess grease out of there. And then we'll just continue pushing it all the way out so that we can work on the other side. Now I'd say we got this side sufficiently greased, and now I'm just pushing it all the way through, wipe off the excess. Final step in this is to actually seal it up with these metal caps on each side, and then we'll move on to the next one and do the exact same thing. Oh no! No. Damn it! This is why you need to be careful, and I was not being careful. You see those? That is like, what, at least 2 or 3 rods popped out there. So not a big deal. We'll be careful about it and put them back into place. All right, crisis averted. So I have it pushed in now so that the rod in the middle is actually holding them all into the place. So they're kind of like halfway showing right there. But yeah, be very, very careful about that. Whew, that was stressful. Okay, now let's do the other half, but carefully. There we go. And it feels pretty nice. Good movement right there. I don't think the suspension will be doing this while I'm riding along, but it's nice to know that it could do this if I needed it to. Now we'll move on to the rods. This is the left one. You can see left. Same concept. We're gonna pop this guy off, push it through ever so slightly, and re-grease. So now we could actually start putting things back together, but I want to take it further and just remove the swing arm entirely, because there are a few bearings in the swing arm, as well as that bolt is a particular spot for rust, even in my climate. So we're going to get a few of the little accessories off the swing arm, like the chain guard, the brakes, of course, need to come off, and then we can crack that bolt loose and hopefully get it out pretty easily. There we go. Whew, yeah, that's how you get that out. Well, after all that struggle, we got the swing arm off and cleaned it up a little bit. I even took off the chain guard, which normally goes around right here, to get that cleaned off and degreased, because that was the worst part of it. But now we're gonna do the exact same thing that we did with the linkage bearings, but just with the swing arm bearings. So now we got the inside greased, and as you can see on the inside here, it actually does stick out a little further, so that way it has some gap between this and the engine block. So I'm actually gonna just put a dab of grease around the outside, just to make sure that that at least is cleaned up and doesn't get rusty. I see there's a little bit of a rust spot actually. So now that we got all of the bearings greased for the linkage assembly as well as the swing arm, I'm actually pleasantly surprised to see how well they are after 3 years and several thousand miles. I was actually expecting that this would be more of a horror story because of the things that I read online, that maybe I would just be looking at something that was bone dry and rusted completely and that I would have to end up replacing everything. I honestly thought I was gonna have to buy replacement bearings, but all good there. Except of course when when it comes to the swing arm bolt. This is how that came out. It is coated in all sorts of corrosion and rust and all sorts of things. So clearly this was the sticking point, and I think if I had left the swing arm in and let that sit for another few years or a few thousand miles, that this would be an absolute nightmare getting out of. So before this goes in, obviously we are going to scrub this thing down clean and re-grease it, as well as I think maybe pack some grease into the engine block where it connects to that as well, just so that there is some grease sitting in there and remaining in there, so that next time I pull this thing out, it's not going to be as much of a horror story. Now it's time for the fun part, install, and we're going to start with what we left off with in the removal, the swing arm. So we got to put that back in place so everything else can attach to it, of course, and make sure when you're putting this in that it goes between the chain, otherwise you'll find out later that your drivetrain is going to be all sorts of messed up. Gotta say, things are a lot easier now that everything is greased up in the install rather than the removal. And I just torqued this thing down. It is 65 foot-pounds, by the way. And now that it is all torqued, you can see, look at this, one finger. Look how easy that moves. That is fantastic. Let's continue. Next up is putting the entire rear brake assembly back on, so that means attaching everything to the frame as well as all the mounting points to the line on the swing arm to keep the line, well, in line. Now time for all the linkage components down below. We're gonna start with the rods. They both connect to the frame in the sections right here on the right and here on the left. Oh, I immediately forgot about this stupid spring. Hold on a second. That's better. Now we can continue and put this right side in. Now moving on to the next step, I'm actually going to attach the knuckle at the swing arm point. So it goes right here between these two. And like I said before, the width is different on each point of the knuckle, so it's pretty easy to see which one it is. In this case, it's the middle one. Now for the next step, I gotta lower the swing arm down. I had it attached with just a strap up top here, so it was out of the way. And the next one I think will be the shock. So right here, where the shock attaches to the knuckle. Last one, the longest bolt, that is from the rod that connects to the knuckle. And now for the kickstand and the foot peg, definitely don't want to forget those. And finally, I struggled to put the rear wheel back on, but as you can see, everything is assembled, and I kind of wish I did this before I greased everything up, but as you can see right now, it is pretty effortless, the movement here. It is nice and easy and is incredibly smooth. So it turns out, at least in my case, that I was not in fact in for a world of hurt after waiting so long. I guess the Honda tech was just particularly generous the day my bike was built, but it's one of those things that you never know until you know, and it only costs a few hours of your time and a few dollars in grease, so you might as well just do it. Especially if you're watching this as it comes out and you're somewhere like up in the north or in the Midwest where the weather is pretty harsh this time of year and your bike's already stored away for the winter. I wish I could sympathize, but I'm too busy riding.